And that will happen here because BC is part of the Western Climate Initiative, and the part you've seen so far, which is the carbon tax, is only a bit of it. There will be a cap-and-trade system with, that's not me, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Oregon, Washington, BC, and Manitoba, of all places. All of them are members of the Western Climate Initiative. And I'm told that it's very likely that soon Ontario and Quebec will announce some emissions trading initiative of their own. So things are starting to break and starting to move. The experience with environmental legislation and major environmental changes over the last 25 years is that everybody starts out by saying it's going to cost X gazillion dollars and it's going to take 15 years. It always takes less time and it always costs much less when people actually get down to it. And my guess is that the costs of dealing with climate change are going to turn out to be a lot less than all the idle speculations we're now beginning to see. Now let me just say 5 things to conclude, and that perhaps will trigger a bit of a discussion. What do we need to do as a country? Well, first we need to remember the #1 issue of the Brundtland report, and that's the world's economy and its environment are so closely linked that policies which ignore in one area which ignore the other are bound to fail. So how do we genuinely integrate the environment into economic decision-making at all levels, including perhaps most importantly at the municipal level? We no longer can make economic decisions without beginning to anticipate their environmental consequences. And there are lots and lots of projects underway that are creating a dialogue on this. Secondly, we need a national sustainable development strategy. This little office of the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development, which we have in Ottawa, which is part of the Auditor General's office, audits federal departments to see whether or not they have pursued their own sustainable development policies. The policies on the whole are vacuous and general and don't actually commit anybody to anything. The Auditor General does a terrific job saying you guys aren't doing anything. Parliament spends one day debating it and everybody goes back to sleep. And part of it is because it's never been put together in a form that the average Canadian can understand. I think it'd be very interesting for British Columbia, which is moving much faster than anybody else, to actually sit down and develop a process, a multi-stakeholder process, to develop a provincial sustainable development strategy. The Premier's put a large chunk of it in place already, and it'd be very interesting to see if you rounded it all out, what would it look like? What would it look like for the Greater Vancouver region? One of the fastest growing regions in Canada. It's an interesting subject. People do get engaged in it. It does bring the community together to have an interesting debate. Thirdly, we need an economic policy which promotes sustainable development. And at the very least, we need to start stripping subsidies out of the economy. I won't go on about this, and my own institute's been looking at the biofuels industry. And corn-based ethanol is one of the biggest hoaxes to come along in the last 50 years. It's heavily subsidized, it has no climate impact, or it may have a negative climate impact, and it doesn't do anything about imported oil, but it's now using 35% of the entire U.S. grain supply to make motor fuel. That's not a particularly sensible policy. We need a national conversation about energy policy. Now, in Ottawa, it's illegal to mention the words national energy and policy in the same sentence, but how can you possibly have the second largest oil reserves in the world and have absolutely no national strategy for dealing with energy? We need a climate policy which is acceptable to Canadians as a whole. Now, what's happening in Canada, which I find fascinating, is what's always happened in the U.S. You get a bunch of states, usually led by California, who mess around with an issue, produce a very unique solution, and then gang up on Washington and say it's about time we had a national policy on this. And I'll give you an example of how sophisticated this can be. I taught us for a semester at Yale 2 years ago, and there were graduate students. 2 of my graduate students, one of them had worked on the Western Climate Initiative with Schwarzenegger's office, and the other one had worked on RGGI, which is the greenhouse gas emissions trading system in the Northeast. And I said to them, did you talk to each other when you were doing this? Oh, yes. I said, so they're compatible? Oh, no. And I said, why not? So we deliberately made them not compatible. I said, why? They won't then be able to be put in a national system. She said, look, can you imagine the average corporation being faced with 2 or 3 different climate change regimes across the state? The first reaction is going to be to head to Washington and say, we can't do business under this circumstance. We need a national plan here so we don't have all these bloody standards. Well, interestingly enough, you now have your own province in Manitoba signed up to Arnold's initiative. You have Alberta with its own rather bizarre plan. You have Quebec, which actually, I hate to say it, had a carbon tax before BC, although it's quite small. And Quebec has done the whole thing. It has a Commissioner for Sustainable Development. It has a Provincial Sustainable Development Strategy. The government has to report on it to the legislature. Even Mr. McGuinty is now kind of unfurling his sails. So we have the provinces charging around, doing all sorts of experimentation in this field. Now, you're way ahead of everybody else. And you should tell people that, and certainly your Premier does, much to the discomfort of much of the rest of them. But there's, I think, a very interesting potential here in Canada for the provinces to force the federal government into being more imaginative in this area. We need to do something about adaptation. Climate change isn't all about stopping crap coming out of a smokestack. It's trying to deal with the kinds of changes we have already. And the farther north you go, the more you'll know we have climate change already. And there are all kinds of things that we need to do, particularly at the local and municipal level. Adaptation is a local exercise. You know, it's bigger sewer pipes, it's not building in floodplain lines, it's a whole bunch of common sense urban planning and urban development. We need to do something, God help us, about natural resources management, which we don't do very well. And we also need to do something about developing countries. Climate change is the quintessential global problem. A ton of carbon emitted in downtown Vancouver has exactly the same effect on the global atmosphere as a ton of carbon emitted in downtown Bangkok. So it's one of those issues that is not going to get solved by Canada alone or the United States or even the OECD countries. China is now the world's largest single emitter of CO2. India is number 3. It'll be number 2 within 4 or 5 years. And the other big developing countries, South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil, are not far behind. So this is a survival issue. It's an issue which we can only deal with globally and internationally. And it's an issue where the cause of it is historically us. And we are not going to get developing countries to hop on board the Climate Express unless we can begin to demonstrate that we're seriously committed to doing it ourselves. And then finally, I think this is a young person's issue. I mean, if I were just starting out in life and contemplating a family, I'd actually be very worried about what was going to happen to my children. The science of climate change is not very pleasant. Alana Mitchell at the back here, who's an award-winning journalist, has just written a book about the oceans, and her hair is still standing on end from the conclusion she's reached. So all the information that comes out makes the situation more and more dire, and therefore we need to get off our asses and do something. And that means doing something at the local level, it means doing something at the provincial level, and it means doing something at the international level. So thanks very much for your attention.